Buenos días a todas y a todos, a quienes acaban de llegar y se incorporan a este seminario internacional. Vamos a dar paso a la conferencia magistral Gobernar los Estados en el siglo XXI, para lo cual cedo la palabra a la doctora Luz María Parcero de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales. Adelante, doctora.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Es para mí un honor moderar esta mesa. Agradezco, por supuesto, al profesor Robledo, al doctor Alejandro Chanona, a la coordinadora del posgrado, a la doctora Valverde, por esta consideración. Tenemos ahora esta mesa denominada Gobernar los Estados en el siglo XXI y nuestro conferencista magistral es el doctor Bob Jessop, quien se encuentra en línea. Les hago la presentación de una breve semblanza. El doctor Jessop es catedrático de Sociología en la Universidad de Lancaster, especialista en teoría del Estado y en economía política. Estudió Sociología en la Universidad de Exeter, realizando posteriormente su doctorado en Sociología Política en Cambridge. La teoría política de Jessop se basa principalmente en considerar al Estado no como algo estático, fruto de una correlación de clases en disputa por el poder, ni tampoco como el centro desde donde la burguesía define las políticas en base a sus prioridades e intereses, sino como una construcción histórica y geográfica, fruto de la interrelación de diferentes estrategias políticas y económicas sobre la cual se construye el poder estatal. Su formación teórica se sustenta en las interpretaciones que el propio Marx define sobre el capital financiero y su relación directa con lo social. Además, se sustenta en las tesis desarrolladas durante el siglo XX por Antonio Gramsci o Nikos Poulantzas, quienes concebían al Estado como una relación social, profundizando sobre las contradicciones y las relaciones entre el Estado y las estructuras de clase, un concepto que Jessop denomina como selectividad estratégica. Entre sus obras se encuentran State Power, Strategic Relational Approach, y junto con Guy Lin Zoom, Towards a Cultural Political Economy, Potent Culture in its Place in Political Economy, the State, Past, Present, Future. Me da mucho gusto que lo recibamos en este evento como conferencista magistral, y les comento que quienes estarán a cargo de los comentarios de esta ponencia son la doctora Judith Bokser Misses, de quien después daré su semblanza, y el doctor Fernando Castañeda Zuno. Adelante, por favor, un gusto tenerle aquí, doctor Jessop.
Right, thank you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, so I'm coming online, and I hope you can follow my presentation. And my topic is governing states in the 21st century. This is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to present a conventional approach to states and statehood. I'm then going to define the normal state as a reference point for discussing other forms of state. And in that context, I will introduce the idea of temporal sovereignty, which is one of the aspects of the state today, which is under great challenge, especially in the 21st century. I'm then going to deal with 4 dimensions of state spatiality, and then I'm going to introduce the ideas of the state in its integral sense from Gramsci and modify it in the light of the ideas of Foucault. And then, because the topic of this whole conference is on modes of governance, I'm going to introduce you to 4 modes of governance and define their relationship. That leads me in turn to discuss meta-governance and calibration, both of which terms I will define. And then in terms of the long period of state formation, I'll discuss multispatial meta-governance. Then I'll finally turn to some challenges of the 21st century, not all of which began in the 21st century. And then I'll reach some conclusions. So let's start with what is the state? And I think there are three aspects of a conventional aspect of the state. The idea is that a territory is controlled by the state. An apparatus makes collectively binding decisions for a resident population subject to state authority. And you'll find this idea presented in the work of Max Weber, Karl Marx, many other state theorists. What we have to do, though, is to recognize that state capacities and state strength vary immensely. There's no general form of the state, and as there are big differences, especially in policy regimes, no general theory of the state is possible. Finally, all states are equal, but some are more equal than others. Some states have more power to shape the world order, most recently, of course, the United States of America, and state strength is linked in part to states' overall power resources, in part to the choice it makes between military and welfare spending. And that's the basic idea of the state. But what I want to do now is to discuss the normal state form, because not all states are the same. And one of the reasons that we can't develop a general theory of the state is that because there are many different forms of state. So we can define the normal state form as a reference point for thinking about the state in terms of the national territorial state. But in addition, there are states that claim extraterritorial reach, for example, the United States and Russia and China increasingly. And we also have the camp, which are forms of concentration camp or other forms of camp taking place within the framework of the national territorial state. Another normal feature of states is the states based on the constitutional state or the rule of law, but most states temporarily suspend the rule of law in case of emergencies. The normal form of state, again, is considered to be the liberal bourgeois democracy, but there are many kinds of exceptional regimes that suspend elections, suspend the rule of law, and introduce various forms of dictatorship. The normal form of state is a tax state. That is to say, it separates the economy and the political and raises its revenues either by taxation or by borrowing on the basis of its ability to raise tax revenues. And in addition, we can see exceptions to this in terms of predatory kleptocracies, that's to say, states based on theft. We have the examples of fiscal crisis which prevent the states raising money, and we have the ideas of default states. And finally, a normal form of state has temporal sovereignty. That is to say, it is able to make decisions according to its own temporal rhythms and routines. And this is subject to challenge, and increasingly so, by emergencies and urgencies. So moving on to more thoughts on temporal sovereignty, I define temporal sovereignty as the ability of the state to make decisions according to its own criteria and temporal rhythms. In other words, the state is able to follow its own rules and procedures in making decisions. And this can take time according to how long it takes to get legislation through Parliament, how long it takes to implement legislation, and so forth. But this is under challenge, the ability of the state to make its decisions according to its own criteria and temporal rhythms due to time-space compression and to the acceleration of social relations on a world scale. In other words, the state is losing its ability to make decisions according to its own criteria and procedural rhythms laid down in the Constitution. And its responses to that include abandon attempts to control short-term economic calculation, activities and movements, but try to control medium to long-term economic decisions and movements. So it doesn't try to intervene and determine exactly what happens within the economy through micromanagement and immediate interventions, but tries to control the medium to long-term economic decisions and movements. And this is one feature of neoliberalism. It can also attempt to compress its decision-making cycles to enable more timely and apt state interventions, so it can speed up decision-making, pass legislation more quickly, even in one day in the case of the United Kingdom. It can plan decision-making in terms of policy options and so forth, and it can try to create relative political time by slowing the circuits of fast capitalism, which lead to time-space compression and the acceleration of social relations on a world scale. Each of these responses is likely to fail, but I think one of the important features that I want to emphasize today is the importance of governance failure. Now we're turning to the 4 dimensions of state spatiality. So to start with, I began with the idea of the state as being the political territorialization. That is to say, the political control of territory as one of the 3 defining features of the state. And we can see this in terms of one dimension of state spatiality, territory. That is to say, the organization of space by drawing frontiers, borders, and boundaries, and distinguishing between inside and outside. But there are also important aspects of the spatiality of the state. There's the relationship between places, and these places are based on proximity, the spatial embedding, and the differentiation of areas. So if you look at states today, they have cores and centers, peripheries, they have local authorities, they have regional authorities, and so forth. And this is based on place and it's related to the spatial division of labor. We can also talk about scale, which is the nested hierarchy of social relations based on vertical differentiation. And if we look at the history of states, it's not always been the national state, which is the peak of the hierarchy. So in the 19th century in Britain, local authorities were more important than national authorities. And if we look today, we can see the emergence of scales that are important above the level of the national state, for example, the European Union. And finally, we can talk about networks as the connection among nodes based on transversal or rhizomatic differentiation. Rhizomatic differentiation has the idea of the roots of a plant which spread in different directions, and networks can be connected based on rhizomatic differentiation. So these are the 4 dimensions of state spatiality. And when we talk about governance, we need to think about the governance of the 4 dimensions, basic dimensions of the state's spatiality. I'm now going to turn to Gramsci, who focused on the modalities of state power rather than its specific institutional mediations. So if we take my basic definition of the state as based on territory, authority, and resident population, when Gramsci was writing, Italy was still in the process of developing its own state, and it did not have a clearly defined crisis-free state. And he focused more on the modalities of state power rather than its specific institutional mediations. In other words, he looked beyond the state in its juridico-political sense to state power as a social relations. And in this sense, he defined lo stato integrale, the state in its integral or inclusive sense, as political society plus civil society. And he argued that the state power in the West, as opposed to the East, was characterized by hegemony armored by coercion. And force was the use of a coercive operation to bring popular masses into conformity with the requirements of the specific mode of production. And hegemony was when the ruling class mobilizes the active consent of dominated groups by intellectual, moral, and political leadership. And he argued that if we want to try to understand the nature of state power, we have to look not just at the state in its institutional dimensions, but also in terms of the ways in which power was exercised. And in that regard, in terms of comparative analysis, he looked at the relative weight across different societies of coercion, fraud, corruption, passive revolution, and active consent. And these are a spectrum running from brute force to fraud, corruption, passive revolution, which is the top-down decapitation of grassroots movements, so they lost their leadership, and the mobilization of active consent. And I want to redefine Gramsci's approach in terms of governance and governmentality. And I will define that then in terms of state equals government plus governance in the shadow of hierarchy. And in this regard, government is more than the state considered as a territory, apparatus, and population. It exercises power in ways that go well beyond imperative coordination dependent on the passage of legislation by the state. Government as a social relation, hegemony armored by coercion or statecraft, involves the practices of calibration, that is to say, rebalancing forms of governance in the shadow of hierarchy, and as such is linked to issues of domination. And calibration is more than a technical problem-solving fix, tied to wider unstable equilibrium of compromise, and it has specific objects, techniques, and subjects of governance. And I'll now introduce you to the idea of governance and calibration. So 4 modes of governance can be defined: exchange, command, dialogue, and solidarity. The rationality of exchange is formal and procedural. There is, in other words, no way in which the market is directly governed. Its procedures are informal and procedural. In other words, markets work through following rules of economic calculation. Command, which is top-down, is substantive and goal-oriented. So it's the state exercises power and tries to achieve collective goals. Dialogue is reflexive and procedural in character. In other words, it involves argument and follows procedures that have no fixed outcome, but are arrived at through negotiated consent. And solidarity is unreflexive and value-oriented. The key medium of exchange is money. The key medium of command is coercion. The key meaning of dialogue is meaning-making. And the key medium of solidarity is commitment. The ideal type of markets are derivatives markets. The ideal type of command is the sovereign state. The ideal type of dialogue is an open network. And the ideal form of solidarity is requited love, that is to say, love that is returned. The criterion of success for exchange is the efficient allocation of scarce resources to competing goals. The efficient criterion of command is effective goal attainment. That is to say, the state commits itself to achieve a collective goal and actually achieves it. The key criterion of success of dialogue is negotiated consent, and the criterion of success for solidarity as an unconditional commitment. And if we say that all forms of governance fail, we recognize the failure of exchange in terms of inefficient allocation, in terms of command, ineffective goal attainment, in terms of dialogue, that parliaments become a talking shop rather than negotiate consent. And in terms of solidarity, the main sign of failure is betrayal, that the commitments have been betrayed. And I now want to introduce the idea of meta-governance. Each mode of governance can fail to realize its objectives. This leads both to attempts to correct it on its own terrain, so you redesign the ways in which markets operate, you redesign the state, you redesign networks, you redesign solidarity, and so you can attempt to correct governance failure in its own terrain or to combine forms of governance to compensate for their respective failures. Meta-governance refers to the governance of governance, and collaboration, which I introduced earlier, refers to attempts to engage in meta-governance by adjusting the relations among modes of governance. And I prefer collaboration here to equilibration, because collaboration involves several modes of governance, and I prefer the term collaboration then to equilibration, which has two modes, like weighing a scale. So if you think of when you're weighing something, you have a weights on one side and something you're weighing on the other side, and you try to bring them into balance. But that's equilibration, and collaboration involves different modes of governance. And I want to say here that the state is an important mode of collaboration, and its activities reflect the changing balance of forces. So we can talk about the different ways in which the state engages in the collaboration of governance. It provides ground rules for governance. It creates forums or organizes dialogue among partners. It ensures the coherence of regimes across scales and over time. It rebalances power differentials and the strategic bias implicit in a given regime. So if the working class becomes too powerful, it tries to limit the power of the working class. And if business becomes too powerful, it tries to increase the power of the working class. And it tries also to modify the strategic selectivity or bias of the states. It attempts to intervene on self-understandings, on interest, identities, and so on. So when people are engaged in dialogue or pursuing their interests within the political arena, it tries to modify the ways in which people understand their interests and identities. It tries to subsidize the production of public goods, organize side payments for those making sacrifices, and so on. It exercises supervision, that is to say, it tries to see more and to supervise what's going on, permitting the expansion, shrinkage, or adjustment of governance. And it identifies the final responsibility for when governance fails. So if the markets fail, it tries to identify what compensates for market failure. When governance fails, it tries to compensate for what happens when the states fail, and so forth. And finally, I want to talk about the state coordinating multispatial meta-governance. That is to say, the state coordinates the spatial dimensions of governance. It involves it in mediating interterritorial relations between states. It involves the interscalar dimensions of states, taking what takes place within the state, outside the state, and beyond states. It involves also cross-border regional governance and so forth. It modifies interplace relations, federal and confederal relations, and it promotes solidarity. And the state has increased its level of multi-spatial meta-governance following the end of empires and colonies and the rise of confederal states such as the European Union. And now I'm going to come to the challenges of the 21st century. And I said at the beginning, not all of these are new to the 21st century, but they may have intensified since then. So one aspect of the challenges of the 21st century is the increased importance of rapid technological change and the disruptions that occurs to established relations, to established institutions, authorities, and so forth. We can talk also about the rise and expansion of BRICS, that is to say, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and also added early on was South Africa, which gives you the mnemonic BRICS. But we can also say that the BRICS have been continued to expand, and as the BRICS have expanded, they're challenging the dominance of the United States. And one of the reactions to this has been Trump's introduction of tariffs and his mercantilism and trying to attract investment back into the United States. And I think this is, whereas the rise and expansion of BRICS predates the 21st century, Trump's tariffs and mercantilism are clearly a product of the 21st century. But how long they will last and how long the tariffs will endure is still open to debate. Another challenge of the 21st century is the rising inequalities of wealth and income, which are in part associated with the development of neoliberalism, but also the growing differentiation between states as they become more or less wealthy, as they grow and expand. Another aspect of one of the challenges of the 21st century is the popular distrust of states and governance. As the challenges have increased, people have become to trust states and governance less. They trust nation states less, they trust local states less, regional states less, federal states less, and so forth. And this leads to an increasing illegitimacy of states and governance. A further challenge of the 21st century is the increasing migration and mobility. People trying to move away from states in crisis, states subject to climate change, to rising levels of seawater and so forth, and people moving away from societies in which warfare is taking place. So we see an increasing array of migrations within states and between states, and the attempts by, and that threatens the territoriality of states. So increasingly, states are worried about the effects of in-migration, of the inability to house migrants and so forth. Another challenge is the rise of climate change and the commitment to net zero. So climate change is man-made, as we know, it's anthropomorphic, but it also leads to growing challenges across nations. So desert countries are more affected by climate change than temperate powers. The Arctic and the Antarctic ice is melting, and that's raising sea levels. And one of the ways in which we see the attempts to respond to climate change are attempts to move towards net zero, that is to say, no new additions to global warming after 2050, with other countries trying to get there closer. So Britain is committed at the moment to trying to get to 80% of net zero by 2030, and finding that difficult as well. So increasingly, states are challenged by climate change, the commitments to net zero, and indeed whether we'll still be here by the end of the 21st century is an open question. Another change which could be related to technological disruption is the rise of artificial intelligence. That is to say, the rise of computers in order to try to reproduce the ways in which the mind thinks, and to move towards generic artificial intelligence. That is to say, to solve problems that humans can't. And I think this is a major challenge to governments and governance in the 21st century. And we're seeing big debates within the United States, within the United Kingdom, within Europe, and so forth, on how governments and states should govern the introduction of artificial intelligence. And people are worried about whether or not artificial intelligence could launch wars on their own initiative, and indeed abolish states. And finally, a final challenge is the rise of authoritarian statism and populism. Authoritarian statism has been there for a long time, but I think we can say that authoritarian statism has grown since the 1970s, when the post-war consensus and the post-war institutional order became under threat, became under crisis, and the rise of authoritarian states emerged. And I think finally authoritarian statism is linked to the rise of authoritarian populism. And again, this is not something peculiar to the 21st century, but something that has been occurring in a more detailed way in the 21st century. This brings me to my conclusions. We can see the decline of the post-war consensus and rule-based order and its linked forms of imperial domination. So while people talk about the post-war order as the rise of liberal bourgeois democracies and the development of welfare states and so forth, there's been a decline of post-war consensus and the rules-based order with its Bretton Woods, IMF, and other institutions, and its linked forms of imperial domination. So the post-war consensus and rule-based order were linked with the rise of imperial domination, the decline of the British Empire, but the rise of the United States as the leading power in the world. And so this is one of the ways in which governance is being reordered in the 21st century. Secondly, we can talk about the proliferation of polycrises, that is to say, multiple crises with multiple dimensions. So we no longer have economic crises or political crises or social crises or environmental crises, but interlinked crises which make it much more difficult to govern them, regulate them, and bring them under control. So the proliferation of polycrises is an aspect of the 21st century which is important and needs to be taken account of. That in turn leads to the search for new forms of governance and meta-governance to deal with these challenges. And one of the ways in which I've talked about that is the increased role of multispatial meta-governance. That is to say, states are trying to intervene in many different spaces, territories, places, networks, and solidarity, and try to bring the polycrisis under some form of control. And finally, in terms of the growing importance of networks and solidarity, to compensate for growing market and state failure, and importance of networks and solidarity to develop new social imaginaries as the basis for ecological crisis resolution. And I think that's one of the most important challenges of the 21st century, which is the need to deal with environmental pollution, climate change, ecological crisis, and the effects of that also on growing migration and mobility. And in order to resolve these, we can't rely just on market forces or top-down state imperative coordination. We need to rely on networks and solidarity and to develop new social imaginaries as the basis for ecological crisis resolution. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I look forward to receiving the comments and then questions. Thank you.
Tiempo completo en el Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales de la UNAM y miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores. Analista y teórico del discurso, ha trabajado durante más de 35 años para comprender cómo el uso del lenguaje mueve y compromete a los seres humanos. Ha realizado por más de 15 años investigaciones sobre los fundamentos de la democracia y sobre los procesos de la democratización. Ha sido invitado a dictar conferencias, impartir cursos y conducir investigaciones en varias universidades del continente americano, Europa y Asia. Sus principales líneas de investigación son planeación y gobierno de la universidad, historia contemporánea de la UNAM y política educativa. Ha publicado 15 libros como autor y coordinador. Adelante, doctor Castaños, unos 10, 15 minutos para su comentario.
Muchas gracias. Agradezco a los organizadores del seminario la invitación a participar en esta mesa. Es muy grato volver a escuchar a... Perdón, sorry. I am grateful to the organizers of this seminar. It's great to listen to Bob Jessop after 4 decades or so. And I'm very glad to be here with Judith Bokser and María Cruz Parcero. I have very recently began thinking about the state, and I have come to this thinking from very different perspectives than the ones we've listened to today. Yet, Bob Jessop's presentation is challenging and encouraging my thinking. It's speeding it up, and I am very, very grateful. I would like to start asking myself, and perhaps suggesting that Bob also asks himself if the state is an essentially concept. I ask this question for various reasons. One is that he emphasizes the variability of forms the state has taken and is perhaps taking. And at one key point in his presentation, he emphasizes that the forms the state has taken and is taking depend on one function of the state and one function of the environment in which the state takes form. That's the function of making meaning. Therefore, I will take a couple of minutes to talk about essentially contested concepts. This is a notion proposed by the Scottish sociologist and philosopher Walter Galley. And one key example of essentially contested concepts he provides is democracy. Unfortunately, outside philosophy, the notion of essentially contested concepts has not been paid much attention. This is perhaps because it might suggest that it presupposes subjective, ungrounded variability, but it's actually the opposite. If concepts like democracy are contested, it is because those who dispute them suppose they're disputing one concept, and there's no place for more than one. And if there is not one, there should be one. They want to capture what society takes as a guide when they use the concept and offer a better formulation of it and perhaps an improvement of it. Without essentially contested concepts, we cannot explain the very limited variability of democracy after 2 or 3 millennia. And we cannot either explain the very, very different forms of democracy from classical to contemporary times, nor the common prototype all democracies share in spite of their differences. There is something else. Galley stresses the use of these concepts in the dynamics that shape, in the case of democracy, political life, but he's thinking about other areas of history when he's thinking about continuity, turning, and effects of conceptual disputes. And because he uses the word use so strongly and so deeply, I might borrow an idea and some wordings from Wittgenstein when he discusses meaning. Conceptual contestations are language games that are part, and by being part of, contribute to the shaping of political life and social life in general. So I want to add a few more questions. If it makes sense to consider the state as an essentially contested concept, can we think about contestations, about argumentations and counter-argumentations that have shaped democracy, that have shaped representation, that have shaped legitimacy? Can we think about the contests that are shaping the state in the same way? That these other contestations have shaped those key concepts for the shaping of political life? Who is the first person? Who is the second person? Who is the third person? For example, starting from the very simple, basic, communicative needs for a conceptual contestation to take place. Another question I want to ask is, are the 4 or 5 dimensions of spatiality Bob Jessop mentions, and the 4 or 5 headings in his matrix: exchange, command, dialogue, solidarity. More or less coupled to the basic genres of social political contestation, namely negotiation, alignment, dispute, and deliberation. I know there's no exact match, but there must be some connection, some overlapping perhaps. If the territory, the place, the scale, and the network are what Bob is suggesting, and if they are changing the way he's suggesting, because the key point, coming back to where I started, is that it's not only the territory as a fixed geographical area, but also the meaning of the territory. It's not only the place from where the state is producing or trying to produce legitimacy, but the meaning of the place. And it is not only going back to the first classical thinking of normal states. It's not only the apparatus, it's not only the population, but the meaning of the apparatus, the meaning of the population. I want to suggest, or to ask again, the question, because as I said, I'm speeding up my thinking. I don't have answers. I want to suggest, or I want to ask myself, if the state is a representer or representative. We are talking about making meaning, to produce or to try to produce legitimacy. Therefore, we are thinking about representation, and we are thinking about representation from a constructivist perspective. The idea of representation from a constructivist perspective is that the representer or representative does not represent the represented directly, but he, she, it, if it's a collective entity, represents an object which the represented endorse and support. And therefore, the question is whether the state is not only being a different representer of the population, but it's becoming a different type of representer. And in so doing, if more than the population, what is being represented now is also a construct, is the object the represented want themselves to be associated with the object the representer is associated with. Is the state representing social and cultural identities? Is the state representing citizenry? Is it representing ethnicity rather than fixed populations confined to a closed territory? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Gracias, doctor Castaños. Now I'm going to present the next commentaries. I will present her in Spanish because our auditor is in Spanish. Es la doctora Judith Bokser, Misses-Liwerant. Ella es profesora emérita de nuestra facultad de la UNAM, profesora titular de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas, es profesor invitada, Distinguished Professor de la Universidad de Hebrea, es miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores y Premio Universidad Nacional 2015, autora de muchas obras, muchos artículos que muchos hemos leído, que la conocemos, y pues le doy la palabra a la doctora Judith Bokser.
Gracias, buenas tardes ya. I still face a dilemma of if I should speak to you in English and share it, or as I prepare several notes that are related to your main analysis and main theoretical approaches, so rich as they are, or I should stay in Spanish. This is a dilemma that I'm trying to solve while I enter this first introduction. I must admit that I asked and I thought that we'll have simultaneous translation. Therefore, Spanglish, therefore, many of the text of Pope, I did translate to quote, right? So that led us really to a problem, which means the way we communicate. I'll explain. The first point I will relate is that someone that has been in research for many years about globalization processes, your contribution to this idea, to this conceptual system of territory, space, scale, and networks brings me to a very rich, I would say, rich way of approaching how the state power exercises its state capacity in spaces that are multi-level, that they are heterogeneous, and they bring us really to conditions of where and how the balance and equilibrium of forces and the capacity of displaying selectively the capacities of the state takes place. On this point, I will switch to Spanish to share with my audience here que creo que una de las contribuciones fundamentales del trabajo de su trabajo, correcto, de Bob, es precisamente el ir abordando de un modo mucho más rico de lo que previamente nosotros teníamos, de un modo sistemático, la organización de las relaciones socioespaciales en múltiples formas. Esta teoría en concreto de territorios, escalas, redes, son dimensiones mutuamente constitutivas, como hoy presentó, y nos permite ver este relacionamiento entrelazado. También me parece muy importante lo planteado en las escalas de verticalidad diferenciada, que no son cualquier escala. El escalamiento supone jerarquías, y en este sentido, gran parte de mis trabajos sobre globalización han apuntado precisamente a ver cómo son procesos en esta dimensión global no homogéneos que se dan de manera diferenciada en tiempo y espacio, con desigualdades territoriales y sectoriales, que tienen además un carácter multifacético en la medida que convocan lo económico, lo político y lo cultural, así como las interdependencias e influencias entre estos niveles. Y en este punto, los planteamientos precisamente de Bob en torno a la necesidad y posibilidad que se exige hoy de ver tanto las interrelaciones de Estado como de la sociedad de un modo integral para comprender precisamente también el carácter multidimensional de los procesos de globalización, porque lo que pudimos ver hoy de un modo muy interesante, tal como lo fue planteando, es que se expresan, son redes de interacción entre instituciones, agentes o transnacionales, hay convergencias, armonización, hay estandarización organizacional, institucional, estrategias culturales, pero también son contradictorios, porque son procesos que pueden ser intencionales y reflexivos, a la vez que no intencionales. Y entonces, el alcance, como podemos ver, hoy muy interesante, en un momento referiré, es internacional, a la vez que regional, nacional o local. Entonces, me parece que esto es un acercamiento y que estos planos de manifestación de estos procesos nos someten a una reflexión en torno a las formas de organización social y política. Se han trastocado los referentes espaciales, tiempo y espacio, como vemos. Ahora, muy interesante que quiero señalar es que hay resonancias de estos procesos con tiempos que se expresan, como lo vimos, en la aceleración de interacciones y flujos, que aquí el Estado tiene un papel fundamental, y también sus funciones, su protagonismo, recupera aspectos esenciales hoy en esta, vamos a decir, en este momento, donde tiene estas vamos a decir, metas tareas, metas funciones, niveles para apoyar el modo de los gobiernos, ¿correcto? Y me parece que todo el tiempo he procurado, y en ese sentido su trabajo me resulta muy estimulante, evitar estos acercamientos hiperglobalizadores, ¿correcto? Unos son entusiastas, otros escépticos, unos críticos, otros apologéticos, pero básicamente esta posibilidad de ver este nivel junto al Estado es uno de los aportes, creo, de su trabajo fundamental. el Estado no como una entidad, y esto me parece un segundo punto muy importante, el Estado no como una entidad, sino como una relación social, con efectos estratégicos diferenciales. Esto significa que el Estado no es algo con una propiedad fija y esencial. Lo que determina esencialmente al Estado es la naturaleza de las relaciones sociales más amplias en las que está situado, especialmente el concepto de equilibrio, o el que hoy propone mucho más elaborado, de fuerzas sociales y los contextos. Esto me parece muy importante. Can you follow me? No at all, right? Can you follow me? No.
Are you asking me?
Yes.
No, I can't follow you at all. I'm sorry. I understood the parts in English, but I'm not following
Well, in the
your
first
Spanish.
part of my comment, I refer to the dimension of your model of territory scales, etc. And I must say that one of your important achievement as an intellectual, as a researcher, is the way you reconsider priors as approaches that you develop. That's the case of the scales, right? And then your reapproachment, bringing all the other dimensions that enrich this. Now I am referring to your conception. So therefore, I said that your development regarding this dimension brings us to understand I would say, the multidimensional nature of state and society. Both require each other to be analyzed. And now I was referring to your conception of state, mainly to your conception as a social relation with the differential impact, right? A strategic impact. And I think that this also, I want to refer to one of your works where you review all the different approaches to state, right? To come to the conclusion that the state is a place of a paradox. And this paradox, I think that it has an in-depth approach, analytical approach I want to stress. From one side, it is I translated your English to Spanish, and now I'm going back from Spanish to English, right? Well, once I was told that if you translate your Spanish to English, you'll shorten your text, right? Well, what I'm meaning now is that from one side, the paradox you underscore is it is a group of institutions, right? A collection, institutional collection, right? Among other ways of social, other forms of social forms, other expression of social form, but also it has the responsibility, as you presented today, to keep the cohesion of the social formation, right? Of which the state is part of, it's the constitutive part. So this is the paradox of the state, right? Which is a part and is a whole of society. And this, I think, it's a very important point, right? I will further continue and look at your conception of the temporal sovereignty, which is, I think, one of the main challenges we face today, right? One has to do for the way that the state has lost his capacity of regulation of fluxes, right? commercial, financial, etc. And simultaneously, it has seen how its capacity to regulate NGOs, human rights demands, etc., bring us simultaneously to a new conception of state sovereignty. It has not to do mainly with the territory, but it has to do precisely to these deteriorated also relations that are today. Well, I want to point to other, I do have the time. First, it's interesting, right? This Machiavellic centaurus of Gramsci, right? Half man and half beast of the state, and the way the power of the state brings us, and this is what you are posing, that we should look at the political society and at the civil society, right? And on this, I think that we are facing today all this concept of citizenship, the private and the public, the relations between the state and civil society, right? And also how we are facing today the limits of the concept of cultural sovereignty. In this, I would like really to emphasize what my colleague Fernando Castaños presented regarding the processes of meaning making. I think that that's a very, very important dimension when you approach it, both analyzing agency and structure. I think that this bringing together both agency and structure allows us to overcome this dualism, this binary approach. And on this I've worked, but I would like just to only probably finish my comments with a reference to what you analyze as one of the challenges of the state in the 21st century that has to do with popular distrust, in states and government. And if we think today in general of a world situation, but also on a regional perspective, I would say Latin America, there is a clear tension in between the efforts to consolidate the transitions to democracy while simultaneously working with a reality of distrust, a reality of break of truth in institutions and in government. And this may explain in a very, I would say, very strong way to approach how populism has developed in our region, but not only in our region, it is a world trend that comes out of distrust in institution and in the state. I mean, the perception of a failed public sphere where states and governments can't fulfill their promises, right? And this critique, and here, the meaning-making dimension or perspective, I think it's fundamental, mainly referring to the importance of the discursive construction of reality that usually populist regimes and populist leaders display. So I think that these are points that are very important for us to reflect today. part of this distrust is also behind the polarization that we are today facing, either at the national level or at the global level, right? At the national level, we see it in all these affective polarization, as has been called, and also on the global level in between BRICS and Trump, as you presented today. So up to here I come, and well, it was a sort of bilingual intervention. Spanglish, you said, right? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the Dr. Judith Bokser. We appreciate the wonderful effort of this translation for Bob Jessop. Le agradecemos mucho, doctora. We have now about 10 minutes for our reaction. I want to introduce a question of a student in the Faculty of Political Sciences for you. This is the question. Given the intensification of challenges like technological disruption, climate change, and so on, how can the four models of governance proposed be mobilized in ways to actively reshape the legitimacy and capacity of state in the specific century? We have about 10 minutes for your reaction. Please, Bob Jessop.
Right, thank you very much. Let me just comment on the two sets of comments and then I'll answer the question from the audience. I think that the idea of essentially contested concepts is very misleading for concepts that have a long history. Friedrich Nietzsche said that any entity that changes cannot be precisely defined. And if we look, for example, at democracy, democracies existed for 3 millennia, and it's changed many times. And so the idea is that democracy will always be an essentially contested concept. And Fernando and Judith both emphasized the importance of meaning making. And this is one of the important parts of the cultural political economy approach that I've developed. And I will follow my colleague Andrew Sayer in saying that many attempts are made to construct subjects by meaning making, but not all meaning makings become actual objects that become realized. And Gramsci says this as well. He says there is a world of difference between ideologies that are arbitrary, rationalistic, and willed, and ideologies that are organic. And not everybody can translate their particular meaning making into reality. And I think this is an important aspect here as well. And so when we're looking at the challenges of the 21st century, they are being interpreted and meanings are attributed to them, but which ones then become important, which ones become the basis for really transforming the world are important. And let me just add that I thought the conference was about governance, and so I focused my remarks on governance in the state, meta-governance of the state, on calibration, rather than talking about the state as such. In relation to the question from the audience, we have to worry about the social forces and institutions that will transform the institutions of the state and make them effective. And that's why I emphasize the importance not just of market failure and state failure, but the importance of building on networks and solidarity to construct new organic ideologies that bear some relationship to being transformed into realities. And I think here that the 21st century challenge, as I said, is whether or not governments, states can coordinate their activities on different scales up to the level of the global and down to the level of the local to challenge and transform the challenges that are occurring. And I also said that I didn't think the challenges that we're facing in the 21st century are all products of the 21st century. Some of them have a longer history. Some of them may be short-term 21st century. So how long Trump survives with his tariffs and so on is an interesting question. And let's hope he doesn't get elected as he claims to be elected to a third term. And I think here the relationship between Mexico, Canada, and the United States will be a key point in dealing with the challenges of the 21st century in this regard. So I think it's important that we look at the ways in which dialogue occurs and who are the partners that are involved in this. And I think too, if we take my more general view of the state as strategic relational, I don't think one would say the state represents anybody in the sense of as citizens and ethnicity and so on. The representative nature of the state is one that is shaped by the institutions and the ways in which they shape the forms of representation, but it's also shaped by the meanings, the political definitions, the political parties, the other social forces that are busy as well. And I think one of the problems here is if we don't take the idea of governance and good governance seriously in the 21st century, we'll not know what it is that the state is attempting to achieve. And what it attempts to achieve will be the product of the changing balance of forces, how they're shaped by institutions, the ways in which the social forces form alliances and so forth, and represent an image of the future. So in terms of the book that I wrote on past, present, and future, one of the things we have to worry about is how we shape our images of the future as a way to mobilize political forces, economic forces, social forces, alliances, and so on, in order to overcome the challenges that we are dealing with. And I don't think that's a very good answer to the question from the audience, because the audience was taking the idea of the challenges in the 21st century as too objective a statement of what they are, instead of looking at them in terms of the ways they're imagined and discoursed about, as well as whether they are really existing challenges in addition. I don't know whether the audience wants to come back.
Thank you very much, Professor Jessop. And we have several questions for your conference. I think we have 5 minutes for the. Do you like to ask a new question for the audience? All right. This is from Laila Cruz, from the Faculty of Political Social Sciences. If one of the main challenges of the 21st century is the distrust of people in governance, will this lead us to delegitimize the government, and which other consequence will it have to not trust the government's system?
I think we see this, the answer to this is seen in the rise of populism and the different forms of populism. So as Ernesto Laclau points out, populism, it always defines itself against the power elite. And if there's distrust in the state and a distrust in governance, populism is a natural response to that, as popular forces seek to define their opposition to the state and to governance, and that mobilizes social forces outside the state and in opposition to the state. and whether or not these opposition forces, populist forces, can be turned into state-making forces or governance-making forces remains to be seen. And I think that the issue of populism, right-wing populism, left-wing populism, centrist populism, is a major problem, as I said, in terms of distrust of states and governance and the rise of populism in that response. And authoritarian statists such as Trump are able to mobilize popular discontent to promise all sorts of things in order to mobilize that discontent. And they, in turn, I think, are likely to lead eventually to people distrusting Trump. So Trump's popularity is already in decline in terms of whether or not people who voted Trump continue to support him or whether or not they don't. And I think this is one of the problems in challenging governance, which is governance almost always fails, and how one responds to governance failure raises problems of meta-governance and calibration. But there's no simple technical fix to those problems and how they emerge. And so everything depends on how the forces mobilize in order to define the problems, to propose solutions, and so on. And this is where meaning making is important, because I pointed out in my own work that crises are objectively overdetermined, but subjectively indeterminate problems. So they have causes, material causes, but how you define the crisis and how you respond to it is not given in the nature of the crisis. And this is why the emergence of polycrises and the multiple nature of the crises is a major problem in terms of getting a consensus on how we understand the nature of the crisis and how we propose to solve it. And this is a question not just of governance and the state, but of the mobilization of social forces in terms of the institutional structures and selectivities of the state.
Thank you very much, Professor Jessop. We finish now this conference. Agradezco también mucho las participaciones de la doctora Bokser, los comentarios de ella y del doctor Castaños. Y bueno, pues no me queda más que invitarles a la siguiente conferencia magistral, que es a la 1:30, El futuro del buen gobierno, con José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, expresidente del gobierno de España, con la moderación del doctor Leonardo Curcio. Y pues entrego la constancia de participación a la doctora Bokser. Gracias a todas, a todos, a todes por su participación. Thank you very much, Professor Jessop.
Right, thank you very much. And I'll leave now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very insightful. We are, people over here in Mexico are really happy to have heard you. And it was a great success in the auditorium. Sorry about the translation. We had a little bit of problem with the team, but it was, I hope you could understand Dr. Bokser.
Yes, I could. Yes, thank you.
Thank you indeed very much.
Okay, thank you.
It's
Bye-bye.
a great pleasure. Whatever you need, you have contact with us, right?
Okay, yes, I will.
Thank you so much. We'll continue with our program today. You're free to join us, and there's also the links to the transmission. But whatever you need. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.